Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Marginalised Notes podcast. In today's episode, Dr. Evelyn AlSultany will guide us through the history and present of Arab and Muslim representation in the US, examining the state's efforts at inclusion and why we must investigate these diversity initiatives. What can we learn from these efforts, and why does it matter for the future? Dr. AlSultany is a professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. She holds a PhD in Modern Thought and Literature from Stanford University in 2005. Her latest book, titled Broken: The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion, published by New York University Press 2022, was listed as one of the 10 best academic books of 2022 by the Chronicle of Higher Education and was a Prose Award finalist. Her latest article is Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia: The University's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Response to October 7th, 2023, published on the Journal of Palestine Studies. Dr. Sultani, it's such a pleasure to have you here, and welcome to the Marginalised Notes podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Let me start by, we have this tradition in the podcast where we like to connect the personal with the academic. We look for academics that we get the sense that they take their research personally. Especially during times where we see that academia is changing into industry, if that would be a way of putting it. But if you can walk us through your journey towards academia, everything that is before, and how your life and your upbringing influenced what you are interested in.
Yes, thank you. So I was born and raised in New York City, and my father was an Iraqi Muslim immigrant to the U.S. My mother was a Cuban Catholic refugee from Cuba, and she passed away when I was young, and my father married my stepmother. She raised me, and she's from Colombia, South America, Catholic. So I grew up in this Arab, Latino, Muslim, Catholic environment in New York City. And looking back in terms of what led me to pursue essentially studying the racialization of Arabs and Muslims and media representations of Arabs and Muslims in the US media, I think about two things. One is that when I was growing up, I knew that we weren't white. I knew we were different. I knew that because we were asked every day, where are you from? Sometimes in a friendly way to connect. Other times it was a signal that we weren't really American. So I was aware that we were different. And then popular culture, my brother and I were obsessed with popular culture. We were watching movies, and a lot of these movies Jack Shaheen writes about in his work, Raiders of the Lost Ark. My favorite was Back to the Future. There's a Libyan terrorist in that one. Raiders of the Lost Ark, also Evil Arabs. A lot of movies that I grew up on, there were evil Arabs. And as a child, I didn't have as children, we don't really have that self-reflection, but I didn't have a language to talk about why I felt embarrassed about my culture, about my heritage, about my family. And so it was when I got to college that I had the opportunity to learn and reflect and have a different kind of understanding about the experiences I had growing up. And what I really longed for was a language to explain the kind of exclusion or marginalization that I experienced as an Arab American, Latina, Muslim child. And in college, I found that there really weren't frameworks. So college was very transformational for me, specifically because I took courses in U.S. ethnic studies and women's studies that gave me a language to talk about power, to talk about identity. But I wanted to know about Arabs and Muslims in the United States. I wanted frameworks to understand that. And in the university, this is in the early 1990s, if you wanted to learn about Arabs or Muslims, okay, if you wanted to learn about Arabs, you did Middle East studies. So I could learn about the Middle East. And if I wanted to learn about Muslims, I could take Islam 101. I could take courses in religious studies, and neither hit the mark. So I was searching, how can I understand, I live in this racialized world, how can I understand our experiences? And there was no language, there was no framework. And so that became my drive in academia to try to figure out a language. And that was before 9/11. So 95, I graduated from college. I never in a million years thought I would be an academic. I come from a family where I'm the first to go to college in my immediate family. So I just never imagined myself becoming an academic. But I did a master's degree, and this was 1998. And I interviewed Iraqis in New York, asking them about their experiences with race and racism. And this was my father's generation of his cohort. And they told me that they didn't identify with the term race or racism, that racism referred to the experiences of African Americans, and that Americans were white, and therefore the term just didn't apply to them, which was I thought, very insightful. We don't even use this language. And when they would explain experiences of discrimination that they experienced, some of them owned stores. They said, people come into my store and they say, go back to your country. And I asked, how do you explain that? And they said, oh, well, it's jealousy. So it was very interesting to see the different language that was used to explain it. And then after 9/11, it was a very different reality, very much in your face. I often wish I could go back and talk to those people again to see how they thought about race and racism after 9/11, but I never had the chance to do that.
But I find here a very interesting and very fundamental moment that you're talking about, that is 9/11. And of course, there's so many literature on 9/11, but in terms of representation, how did the world of media representation, or later you will talk about institutional representation of the Muslim Arab or the Muslim and or the Arab, how did this world look like before 9/11? Was it still about terrorism? Was it about something else? You talk about Orientalism? How would you explain that world?
Yeah. So the world before 9/11 was still one in which Arabs and Muslims were cast as terrorists. And in my research, specifically around media, what I found is that the stereotype of the terrorist really emerges out of the Israeli-Palestinian quote-unquote conflict. And it's after the invasion of Palestine and the colonization of Palestine that we start seeing Palestinians cast as terrorists. And actually, recently, the scholar Daryl Lee wrote an article for Palestine Legal, where he traces a history of U.S. policies, U.S. counterterrorism policies, and he shows that it's always been linked to Palestine. It's always been a Zionist point of view in American law when it comes to terrorism, counterterrorism. So there's a very long history in the United States before 9/11, which is what made the blanket demonization of Arabs and Muslims after 9/11 possible. It's not like 9/11 happened and suddenly all Arabs and Muslims were demonized, but rather it was influenced by decades of policymaking and decades of media representations. So I often turn to Melanie McAllister's book, Epic Encounters, where she shows us how the Middle East became meaningful to Americans through a series of political events and how they were portrayed to the U.S. public. And so one such event would be the Arab oil embargo in 1973, where Arab oil producers refused to sell oil to the United States so long as they were supporting Israel against Palestinians. And through that moment, Arabs were portrayed as a threat to the American economy. They're going to come here, they're going to take your money, they're going to buy up all of America, and they're going to threaten the American lifestyle. And then the next moment that she points to is 1979, the Iran hostage crisis, when Iranian students took U.S. embassy staff people hostage because the United States had given safe passage to their leader, and they wanted him back to stand trial for all of the human rights abuses. And as a result of that, in the United States media, every single day was the hostage crisis. And Iranians, in this case, came to be conflated with Arabs and Muslims and everyone in the Middle East. And they were portrayed as a threat to American families. So there's a precedent. There are other moments along the way, but there is a very long precedent of portraying Arabs, Muslims, Iranians as threatening to Americans. And that's the environment I grew up in. So 9/11, it became very blatant. Everyone else could see it. But beforehand, it was happening, but we didn't really talk about it. We didn't have a language to talk about it. Yes, Edward Said fortunately gave us the term Orientalism that helped us analyze so much. I didn't learn the term Orientalism until I was getting my master's degree. It's not something that's in common speech. It's not like I'm sitting at the dinner table with my family and we're talking about Orientalism and what that means and how that helps us understand a phenomenon. But it was a very significant piece of scholarship that really helped so many, including myself, in terms of developing new frameworks to understand the specific kind of othering that Arabs and Muslims experience in the United States.
Now, first, thank you so much for this explanation, but also I want to focus on what do we mean when we say representation? Because this is also one of the things that this one we might be using more often, more than Orientalism, but also what it means within your work. It means something specific, something deeper, something more complex, something that is deliberately done. There is a machine of representation. There are politics of representation. So if you can give us a 101 representation of what that means. What do we mean when we say representation?
So representation can mean many things, including in politics, if your region is represented. But when I'm talking about media representations, it's about the kinds of images and logics that we receive through the media and its impact. And I think one of the best ways to explain it is that media is not simply entertainment. It's a phrase many people say, and I've even been privy to Hollywood executives saying, oh, it's just entertainment. It doesn't have an impact, but media has a tremendous impact. One of the studies that I often refer to is by a scholar, Muniba Salim, who did a study to see what is the impact of consuming repeated portrayals of Arabs and Muslims as terrorists. And she found that the more you consume these images, the more likely it is that you will support policies either targeting Muslims abroad, so supporting wars against Muslim majority populations, or supporting restrictions on civil liberties in the United States. So she shows that there is a direct correlation between the kinds of images that we consume and the policies that we support. She also showed that if we consume positive or even neutral images of Arabs and Muslims, that the reverse happens, that you're less likely to support murderous policies abroad and civil rights restrictions here in the United States. So when I'm talking about representation, I am referring to something that's very powerful, very influential, and does have life and death consequences and are not simply entertainment.
First of all, I cannot help but notice how you work within the existing literature, and it shows the point you were talking about, that you were looking for this. Who can tell us about what's happening? I just want to highlight this to for the audience also to go and check this literature that you're mentioning. But I also want to talk about your own contribution, and you talked about simplified, complex representation. You are also talking about something that has more into it, even within the politics of good and bad representation. And let's start by, if you can walk us through this concept of simplified, complex representation. What does that mean, and how does that work?
Yes. So after 9/11, I was surprised to see that there were some positive or sympathetic portrayals of Arabs and Muslims in the media. So, for example, in TV dramas, I'd be watching a TV drama, legal drama, medical drama, and you would see a patriotic Arab American character who is either helping the United States government in their fight against terrorism or a victim to hate crimes. And so as an audience member, you would feel sympathy for them, or you'd see them as good. And in the large scheme of things, this is a positive development, because historically, Arabs are the bad guys on TV and in the movies, and we celebrate when they're killed. They're evil. They should be killed, and so we celebrate when they're dead. And now, after 9/11, there was this opportunity, a small one, but it was there, and many shows wrote in a sympathetic character, wrote in a patriotic Arab or Muslim. And I was curious, is this making an impact? What is this? I was expecting more terrorist portrayals after 9/11, and there were many, and there still are many. But there was a movement to, often in response to civil rights groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, approached certain TV shows and said, we're really concerned about fueling the fire, perpetuating the stereotype. So we start seeing these efforts. So I was watching all of these shows, and at a certain point, it became very annoying to watch TV with me because I figured out the formula. And so we'd be watching, let's say, the TV drama 24 that was very popular for a long time. And while we were watching, I would say that Arab terrorist bad guy is going to turn out to be good, and that white president of the United States is going to be the mastermind of the terrorist attack. And these are very common new approaches to telling stories about terrorism. And so I was trying to figure out a term to capture what was happening. And simplified, complex refers to the effort of writers and producers to create complex storylines. So we have the inclusion of, as I mentioned, a victimized Arab American, or you think the Arab is responsible for the terrorist plot, but it turns out it's the white guy at the end. And so they're trying to make their storylines more complicated, but it's actually very formulaic, very simple, and it doesn't really move the needle. So on the surface, oh, great, they're not all bad. They're exceptions. But we were still getting stories about Arabs and Muslims most of the time in the context of terrorism, good or bad, in the context of terrorism. So my critique was that it wasn't a real shift in representations. And it's not that it wasn't meaningful in some way, that it didn't provide a small opening, but that it was not a paradigm shift or anything particularly meaningful. And a lot of my research has been around examining quote unquote positive representations to understand how they're operating. And what I found is to not take them at face value, that oftentimes you can have a positive representation that is still feeding a narrative of exclusion. And I have lots of examples if you'd like me to get into any of them.
Absolutely, because I want to ask about this, because you problematize the good representation also. You stated that in your book, and I want to understand this more. When you say that even the good is problematic because the underlying logic is still the same, what does that mean?
So I'll take one example from the immediate post 9/11 landscape. There was a legal drama, and the storyline was that an airline said they're not going to allow Arabs to fly on the airline. And so we're in the courtroom, and the judge is trying to make a decision. And he says, I can't believe we're even having this conversation. This is absolutely ridiculous. And as a viewer, you agree. This is injustice. How can an airline say that they're not going to allow an entire group of people to fly on the airline? So you feel as an audience member angry, and this is unjust. And then the judge at the very end of the show comes out and says it is unjust and this is terrible and I can't believe it. But because we are in a moment of exception, because we are in a moment of emergency, he's letting the ruling stand, and the airline can discriminate against Arabs. And it's very somber, and he's really upset saying it. He doesn't say it lightly. But when you think about it afterwards, even though it's cast as something that's not just, it's justified. And it very much reflected the thinking of the time period. I remember reading, and it really influenced my work, Giorgio Agamben. He had this idea of the logic of exception, which is how democratic societies can use emergencies to disregard any kind of democratic process. And we saw that a lot after 9/11. We're against torture. The United States does not torture, but this is an emergency. We have no choice. Racism, the United States is against racism. We don't racially profile. Of course they do, but we don't racially profile, but we have to because of this emergency situation we're in. So citizens were given a choice. You want civil liberties or national security? This was one of the very key logics after 9/11. And if you want civil liberties, then you're basically dumb because you're giving up national security. You can't have both. You have to pick one or the other. So this emergency situation was used, the logic of exception, to justify exclusion, to justify torture, to justify war, murder, no due process, etc. And TV shows were very much repeating that logic and normalizing it.
Within this context, who's the author? And by that I mean, I have friends who are working on media representations and film representations, and there is also trying to find or trying to make sense of these movies that were produced on the war on terror or the war in Iraq or else. But it is very rare to see movies analysis functioning or being inspected the same way that we have with written materials, with books, where you can you can use Foucault, you can use the author theory, you can talk about power and knowledge production, and within film, within TV dramas, within these forms of representations, why is this side lacking? You can dissect written material, and you can deploy these theories to dissect it, to analyze it, to relate it to the author, to relate it to the context. But when it comes to film, it becomes more complicated than this because there's production in that, and there are media companies. And where should we look to analyze who's the author in this formula?
Yeah, who's the author? What came to my mind while you were speaking was that not all of Hollywood, but there are pockets that are very much embedded with the government. So I remember, that I mentioned the TV show 24 because it was so popular. It was around, I think, for 10, 11 seasons. Each season had a different terrorist. It wasn't always an Arab or Muslim terrorist. But I remember the White House invited the producers of 24 to talk fact or fiction, war on terror. Is it real? Is it not? Is it depicted so there was a sense of collaboration, and then other filmmakers who want to portray the US government's and situations of war on terror. If they want to use military equipment, then the US government does have a process of vetting scripts to ensure that they are not terribly portrayed. So there is some level of that kind of collaboration. And I have done some consulting in Hollywood. And I do remember one particular meeting with the president of a media company. And he said that, they might start their production of a show and have a conversation about diversity and not stereotyping. But then if they don't have a writer or producer who is of that particular identity, it falls off the table. There's a million other considerations in producing a movie that the question of diversity or representation becomes irrelevant at a certain point unless there's someone for whom it is very important, who keeps bringing it up, and insisting that it be addressed. So it seemed like it's easily an afterthought and not something that is taken seriously. They're thinking more about money making, and you don't lose money by portraying Arabs as terrorists. Other groups maybe, but it's still viable. You don't lose money by creating another Aladdin that's Orientalist. It's still making money. There's still an audience for it, and as long as there is an audience for it, there won't necessarily be a profound change.
If we look at representation within the broader context of war on terror, to what extent was representation deliberately instrumentalized, and how pivotal, how fundamental was it to the equation of war on terror and the policies that came with it?
So a lot of my research, as you mentioned, looks at the positive representations. And the argument in my book was that the positive representations are helping to produce a kind of racism where you believe we're better. We don't do that anymore. I remember hearing people say, this isn't Japanese internment. We didn't get all Arabs and lock them up. This is different. We're in a different time. We're more aware. We're more compassionate. So I think that the positive representations played a role in soothing Americans, some of them, who care about questions of diversity and demonizing a group of people, soothed us into believing that it wasn't so bad, that the US had changed. But meanwhile, Afghanistan was invaded. Iraq was invaded. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but we were told there were weapons of mass destruction. Entire blatant lies, killing of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, was the consequence of that. So when I look at the positive representations, I see it as dangerous. It's, on the one hand, I felt soothed, like, oh, good, they're not demonizing all of us. And then I wanted to know, okay, but how is this working? Is it really making a difference in terms of how Americans understand Arabs, how Americans understand Muslims? And oftentimes, I don't have a study like Muniba Salim's to show it, but it seemed that for some people, it was very soothing. For others, it was this idea of the exception. Okay, there are one or two good ones. They're not all bad. And that doesn't really help.
I want to talk more about logic of exception, but before that, I want to ask you this. How could you imagine an agenda, a to-do list, to be a good Muslim, Arab, American citizen? What does that look like?
Okay, that's a great question, because there was a huge debate after 9/11. What does it mean to be a good citizen? And the government's version was, you don't question the government. That was the sense at the time. Like after 9/11, there were lists of most dangerous professors because they question US policy. It was such a tense time. People were scared, and people started really buckling down on really narrow conceptions of citizenship. And others argued that to be a US citizen, you fight for democracy, you fight for freedom, you fight for the Constitution, you question your government. And a lot of the representations around good or bad Arabs highlights that there was a narrative that if you're good, Mahmoud Mamdani writes about this, good Muslim, bad Muslim. If you're good, you support the US government, period. So we did have Arabs and Muslims, putting flags outside of their homes and their businesses, hoping that would protect them. So there was a specific version of a patriotic Arab Muslim, and some people really tried to prove that, to try to belong. But there was no guaranteed path to belonging for Arabs and Muslims.
But when you talk about Arab Muslims in America, you also talk about categories here, and I don't know if we can portray it in terms of a spectrum, but we talk about Arab non-Muslims or non-Arab Muslims or women, and does it play differently for these different categories? If you are a non-Muslim Arab, if you are a non-Arab Muslim, if you are a non-Arab or non-Muslim woman?
Yes.
It does play differently.
It does.
How?
So the reality is, with media representations, the Arab Muslim with Iran has been conflated and co-produced. So oftentimes with media representations, it's hard to disentangle Arab from Muslim because they've been produced as one and the same. More recently, and this is after the Muslim ban, I have tracked changes not only after 9/11, but 10 years after, and then after the Muslim ban, we start seeing some openings in representation, some examples of Muslims who are writers, and they are finally getting their stories out there. So I'm thinking about Rami, for example, on Hulu, Mo on Netflix.
And their recent work, the Number One Happy Family,
Number
USA.
One Happy Family.
Yes.
Yeah. And there are others. So those examples that I mentioned of Muslims creating their own shows and actually having the opportunity to produce them, we start seeing an opening of Muslim identities. And it also happens after the Muslim ban. For example, in the US, we start seeing more Black Muslim representation. Because oftentimes Black Muslims are annoyed, like, why are we always talking about Arab Muslims? What about Black Muslims? But the way in which this identity has been produced, it's front and center in the media. But we started seeing an expansion. So, for example, on NCIS Los Angeles, LL Cool J's character comes out as Muslim after the Muslim ban. So we have this character for years on television, and suddenly after the Muslim ban, he reveals that he is Muslim. On Jack Ryan on Amazon, the first season, Jim Greer works with the CIA. He's a Black Muslim. So we see some kind of effort after the Muslim ban to try to disentangle Arab from Muslim and see a little bit some kind of diverse portrayal of who a Muslim is and can be. But historically, this identity, Arab Muslim, Iranian conflated, has been repeated over and over again, to the extent that people believe Arabs and Muslims are the same thing and are not aware that I think 15% of the global Muslim population is Arab. Most people think it's 100%. So it's fed into this misinformation about these communities.
Now, in anthropology, for example, we focus a lot about the living experience of the people, and I want to ask you about this. Like, for example, if we say representation is complex and it is harmful, and I'm quoting you here, it can be a matter of life or death. To what extent people actually felt danger by being represented in this way? How did it affect their day-to-day lives?
Mm-hmm. So after 9/11, there have been, and we see different versions now with the question with Palestine, uh, but there have been many instances of people being detained, deported. Guantanamo Bay Prison was created after 9/11. Arab Muslim men were held there without due process, without being charged with a crime. So there has been many hate crimes. I mean, I think about the 3 students in North Carolina in 2015 who were murdered by their neighbor. I think about the Palestinian boy who was 6 years old, murdered by his neighbor in Chicago, outside of Chicago. So there is an impact on an interpersonal and personal level. And I think that one of the ways that hate crimes work is that even if I have not been a victim of violence, I've been a victim of ignorance, of people asking questions that are very ignorant, but I have not been a victim of violence. The awareness that people like you are being targeted, are facing violence, are facing a lack of rights has an impact. And that's for any community that's a victim of hate crime. So if you're a Black American and you have not been pulled over by the police and you have not been harassed and you have not been put in jail, you know it's possible. You live with that awareness because you watch that happen to other people who are like you. So I think that's how hate crimes work. So on the level of media representations and government policies, there's a definition of anti-Muslim racism that I go to, and it was defined by the scholars Nadine Naber and Junaid Rana. And they say that anti-Muslim racism is the interpersonal, media, and government targeting of Muslims or people who appear to be Muslim, because oftentimes Sikh Americans who are Indian are targeted, other people are targeted, and that the targeting is based on the idea that Muslims are a threat to U.S. national security. We can expand that to Israeli security, broadly speaking, a threat to national security. And so I find that definition very helpful because oftentimes in the United States, we tend to talk about Islamophobia when there's a hate crime. And then we tend to make it individual. It's an individual problem. And the state cares. The state is going to prosecute the person who committed the hate crime. But then somehow in the process, we forget about the different levels and how they're connected. So if someone is a victim of a hate crime, it's not because this ignorant person did something to them. That ignorant person, quote unquote ignorant person, received messages from the media, policies from the government. We're going to go bomb these people. We're going to deny these other people rights. So they're acting on information that they have. They're acting on their perception. And so it's all related. And in my more recent book, I do have a chapter on hate crimes where I make the argument that the rubric of hate, we're going to stand against hate. We're against hate is actually not helping us think productively about hate crimes, mainly because it lets the state off the hook. And we need to hold the state accountable and the media accountable for the everyday consequences in people's lives.
I think I want to leave the part where what we have to do or what we can do to give it more time, because I really want to hear your thoughts on that. But for now, I'm interested in this concept of diversity, multiculturalism, inclusion, and there is an existing literature that is talking about multiculturalism as regulating or managing race and the racialization that happens, that comes with that. And there is also an existing literature, I think it was Conning, I don't remember his first name, he wrote about Muslims in Netherlands, racializing Muslims in Netherlands. And he also talks about how how also secularism is in a way is about regulating religion after all. But there is a common thing here, which I have thought about hearing you speaking, which is basically the underlying structure and logic of the nation state. And to what extent, because when we hear, well, the state cares about diversity, the state cares about multiculturalism, the state cares about secularism in a positive connotation, of course. And how can this be problematic? Because what kind of multiculturalism is this? What are the politics that come with multiculturalism and diversity and inclusion and secularism? And why can they be problematic? Or if they are?
Yes, I have a lot to say about that.
Please do.
So what's interesting is right now with the Trump administration, they don't care about diversity. They don't care about inclusion explicitly. It's now illegal. You have to remove it and scrub it from your websites. I saw recently the conditions to accept a grant from the National Institute of Health, which is a government granting organization. And there are two conditions to accept. They've removed grants from people who had them, and now they have these new guidelines. Number one, you're not going to study diversity or do anything regarding anything to do with diversity. And number two, you're not going to boycott Israel. And these go hand in hand. Those are the two conditions if you're going to accept a grant from the National Institute of Health right now under the Trump administration. But my book, Broken, The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion, examines diversity, equity, inclusion efforts and how they included Muslims. Because historically in the United States, after the Civil Rights Movement, after a long history of slavery, where Black people were enslaved, Native American people were dispossessed of their land, there was a Jim Crow era of segregation, and then in the 1960s, we have the Civil Rights Movement that leads to profound legal changes where for the first time, discrimination becomes illegal and affirmative action is created. Affirmative action is supposed to repair centuries of discrimination. And from the very beginning, it's been contested. And now it's illegal. So diversity emerged out of affirmative action as an alternative because diversity is more inclusive. Affirmative action was specifically to include women who had been historically excluded, Black people, Native Americans, Latinos. And so diversity, it's for everybody. And there's actually a 2003 legal case where a white woman, Barbara Grutter, sued the University of Michigan for not getting in. She said that they discriminated against her as a white woman. And the legal proceedings, so some legal scholars have pointed out that there was a strategy used that had huge implications for how we would think about diversity and affirmative action in the United States. And the legal strategy was, instead of saying, we're using affirmative action to correct historical discrimination as a form of repair, instead they said, we're using affirmative action because diversity benefits everyone. If you come to school here and you're around people from all over the world and diverse points of views, you're going to be marketable and it's beneficial to everyone. So this idea of diversity emerged. It's not excluding white people. It's not excluding anybody. It's including and it's beneficial. But now it's basically becoming illegal. So any kind of effort towards inclusion or repair has been attacked, and there have been efforts forever to...
Yes, but the way you portrayed it was also in a way problematizing it, because you called it quote unquote crisis diversity. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I get the sense that you were insinuating that, well, it hasn't been really that genuine all along.
Yes, correct.
Did I get that right? Okay, so
that is correct.
Yeah, so why do you think that it hasn't already been that genuine, and you call it crisis diversity?
Yes. I call it crisis diversity to point to how Muslims get included in it. So since diversity is for everybody, you can include LGBTQ people, you can include Muslims, you can include people who are neurodiverse, as opposed to the specific categories in affirmative action. And so Muslims came to be included in diversity through the recognition of Islamophobia as a problem. And Islamophobia really became recognized as a term and a problem. It wasn't even right after 9/11. It's roughly around 2010 with the Ground Zero mosque controversy, when a Muslim community center was planned to be built a few blocks away from the site of the 9/11 attacks. And some right-wing people claimed that it was going to be right on the site of 9/11. And many people were aware that this was happening and saw it as an instance of Islamophobia. But in the book, I track the inclusion of Muslims and then the failure. And so I think one apt example, I have two chapters on media, one on law, one on speech controversies, and one on the university. So universities, with this rubric of diversity, have tried to create more inclusive campuses for Muslims and Arabs. So at the University of Michigan, where I used to teach, there is an Arab graduation. So there's an LGBTQ graduation, there's a Latinx graduation, there's a Native American graduation. They included an Arab graduation. There's an Edward Said lounge. So there are many different lounges on campus, multicultural lounges, Angela Davis Lounge, Mahatma Gandhi Lounge. They created an Edward Said lounge. Prayer spaces. So there are reflection rooms on campus. They increase the number of reflection rooms. You can use them for anything, but Muslim students who pray 5 times a day can use these reflection rooms. They don't have to walk 15 minutes across campus. So there have been all these efforts, halal food, during Ramadan, making sure students have access to breakfast, before they start their fast. So all of that's happening, which sounds good. It's a great development. But then when those very same students are involved in Palestine rights activism, they are targeted. We've seen since October 7 extreme targeting, arresting students, expelling students. But even before October 7, my book concentrates in the 2010s at the University of Michigan. It was very common for students to be doxxed, harassed, and leave the university extremely traumatized by their experiences. They didn't feel that the university protected them against outside Zionist groups attacking them. And so the question here is, you can do all of these things to create an inclusive campus, and then when those very same students are attacked and harassed and you don't protect them, that is the opposite of inclusion. Arresting your students is the opposite of inclusion. It directly contradicts the entire point of having a value of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Now, you also portray this as cultural politics. Mm-hmm. That it's not really about diversity. It's not about inclusion. It's cultural politics. Yeah. But at the same time, I also want to talk about how we get to know more about this now. The incidents you're mentioning, not many people know about it. At least those who are by far not affected by it, and that can include even Muslims and Arabs in the U.S. and outside. Does that mean that getting to know about these incidents now, getting to know about the scale, does that mean that in a way this is better? This is on our side, that this is an advantage on these students' side, on Arab and Muslim side?
I think that if there's any advantage right now regarding Palestine, it's that more people know about it. More people understand a history of ethnic cleansing and apartheid and incredible violence.
If we're talking about a structural problem within the country, and here I'm not just talking about the US, I'm talking about the nation state. If we are saying that there is a structural underlying logic that will always prioritize national security, and the way it plays out has proven itself to be drastic to many people by the borders, people that are marginalized, students that are that might be a clear compass to a number of people. So, are we actually here supposed to talk about just Arabs and Muslims, or are there things that are more structural to the state itself that people need to figure out, to address, or find the language for?
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes. I mean, I agree with your assessments of the state seeking power over people, and that the marginalization of Arabs and Muslims is just one group of people. And that, I mean, the whole point of diversity is to question privileging the rights and experiences of the white heterosexual man who's able-bodied and middle class and so on and so forth. So there are so many communities that have been disenfranchised, that are targeted at different moments in history. And I do think it is useful to connect those dots, to have a more of a unifying, a way to unify people who have been marginalized for so long, not uniquely an Arab Muslim approach, even though that is my focus.
Yes. When it comes to university, you have also mentioned other incidents, but how do you see things playing out in terms of over the decades? Because we have the student movement during the 60s, we have the Vietnam War, we have the war in Iraq, and we have what's happening right now. How do you see it playing out as someone that is looking at this closely?
Yeah. Many people have said that the recent protests on college campuses, the encampments, is the largest student protest that we've ever seen in the United States. And I think that's really significant. I think it's significant that the students who are involved are of all backgrounds. There was a time where it seemed that the majority of students who were advocating for Palestinian rights were majority Arab students or Muslim students. And now it's students from every possible background: white, Asian, Jewish, etc. And so I think that's really a profound and significant turn to have allies and such a strong coalition of students. But the repression, I've been marveling at how the Trump administration removed funding from Columbia University, for example, accusing them of anti-Semitism, when if you look at what Columbia University did, they arrested the students who were advocating for Palestine. They've shown themselves to be aligned with Zionist interests, yet they're still being punished. Harvard right now is seen as a hero because they're standing up to Trump, even though he has withdrawn a lot of their funding. But they had already adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which means that criticisms of Israel are considered to be anti-Semitic. So they have also aligned themselves with Zionist interests, yet right now we're celebrating them for standing up to Trump. So we are seeing that most universities are not protecting their students, but rather aligning themselves, perhaps because of donors or other issues around funding. And but this was even before Trump. They're not protecting their students, but rather aligning themselves with Zionist interests, which I think also says a lot about the United States as a whole, and how the United States has aligned itself with Israel, has aligned itself with Zionism for decades. And now, we're seeing very clearly how universities are parroting that kind of approach.
Within this context, people talk about, not people, activists are talking about the relation between fascism and anti-intellectualism. What does that mean? What does intellectualism mean? Why is it important? Why is it a fascist trait to target intellectuals and intellectualism?
Yeah, right now we are seeing an attack on intellectualism at universities. One example that comes to mind, and this was before Trump came to power, but I think his approach exemplifies this. So one of the courses that I teach is about racism in U.S. history. It's not specifically about Arabs or Muslims. And it's always been contentious. How are you going to teach it? Are you going to teach about this history of slavery? Senator Tom Cotton said a few years ago that slavery should be taught as something good. It benefited Black people. They gained skills, important job skills. So these kinds of conversations, these kinds of contentious moments have always been there. And for the people on the right who are trying to dismantle education, they want a very specific nationalist perspective, and they see education, critical thinking as a threat to a very simplistic approach to patriotism. I remember after 9/11, some scholars were criticizing the Middle East Studies Association because they didn't predict 9/11, so they were failures as intellectuals. And recently, there's been, over the last 10 years, book bannings, so removing LGBTQ and stories about diverse communities from libraries. In California, the governor approved an ethnic studies curriculum in high schools. And then the group of people that was trying to put that together, there was a lot of tension, specifically around the Arab American portion because it included Palestine. And so some Zionist organizations organized to make sure that the Arab American perspective on Palestine would not be included. So education has long been a battlefield, and having government officials, which they're doing right now, telling universities and minutia at Columbia University, they're literally involved in how one department is running, I do think is very clear evidence of fascism and anti-intellectualism.
Now, one of the things some intellectuals, a number of intellectuals talked about is how Trump is not about Trump or Trumpism. There's no ism in Trump. It's America wearing a right-wing suit. But it's and it's always, I can't help but say that, but it's always funny when Americans talk about American left, because the bar is a bit low when you compare with, when you compare with other lefts. So to what extent are we considering this a Trump problem and not a US problem?
Yes. So since Trump was elected the second time, a lot of people are panicking, stressed, disturbed, commenting about fascism and the end of democracy. And I find that I have a knee-jerk response, which is that we never really had a democracy. We've been attempting a democracy. We've been back and forth with this question of democracy. And I've really been trying to sort through what's new and what's old. So part of me thinks, don't we all remember the war on terror and what happened? And there was no due process, and there was a rewriting of torture laws. And so I've been trying to figure out what's new and what's old. And I think that perhaps what's new, because there is something new here, it's not all old, but there's precedent. So 2 examples for the precedent. One is Trump had students who were active in pro-Palestinian rights activism arrested. They are green card holders. And people are concerned about what does this mean for immigrants and their First Amendment rights, and what does it mean for Palestine. We have a very long history of repression in the United States when it comes to speech for Palestinian rights. So I think, for example, in 1987, there was a case that's referred to as the LA 8, the Los Angeles 8. It was 7 Palestinians and 1 Kenyan woman, and they were arrested, and they were in and out of deportation proceedings for 20 years because of their speech for Palestine. So what we're seeing now is not new. There is a precedent. Since 2013, 30 states in the United States have passed laws that state you are not allowed to boycott the state of Israel. So what's happening now is not new and out of the blue. We can point to many instances throughout US history where we see this. What's new is that Trump doesn't care about the Constitution. So during George Bush and the years of rewriting torture laws, there were two logics that were used. One was, well, yeah, we signed the Geneva Conventions, but Al-Qaeda didn't. So legally, we don't have to follow the Geneva Conventions because Al-Qaeda is not a state. And so they found these loopholes and gray areas in the law, but they still presented to the American people that they were using the law, even though they were exploiting the loopholes. And then the second thing, they use this logic of exception that we talked about before to justify a lack of due process. I think Trump was asked the other day about the Constitution if it matters, and he said it didn't matter. So there is an authoritarian strain that is happening, but a lot of what is happening is not necessarily new. I do think thinking 9/11 compared to now is that after 9/11, a lot of Arabs and Muslims were impacted, and then therefore the whole community was impacted by default. And now, I mean, I know a lot of people whose funding was taken away, or people who, I see these students who were arrested, they could be my students. So I think a lot of people have been fired from their jobs. So I think most people know someone who's impacted. So the impact feels more severe for many than it was after 9/11.
Within this, I want to ask you about this too. While you're reading, while you're researching, and while you're writing, you're also getting exposed to different kinds of stories, and not just within our time, but also historical accounts of, parts of this and that has been going on, that has existed before, situations that might be repeating themselves, albeit in different shapes or forms. And within this, looking at these experiences, how do communities, how do the people or the peoples resist this? How can people resist in terms of representation, in terms of institutional and structural logics of national security policies that are discriminatory, that are marginalizing, that are fear-inducing? What can the people do?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the ability to analyze. And I think that when the government is trying to take away your ability to analyze, it's challenging, but we will continue to do what we do and analyze. I think it is really important part of organizing is having a language and having analysis of power. And that is what they're trying to prevent, that kind of analysis of power. In terms of representation, I haven't been, after the Muslim ban, there was an expansion in representations of Muslims that was unprecedented. And my thinking at the time was, because it's driven around crisis, Muslim ban was the crisis, and then Hollywood included more Muslim characters. I thought around October 7, this is over. We're not going to see more representations of Muslims. But then recently, we had Muslim Matchmaker on Hulu, Deli Boys on Hulu, the show that you mentioned, Number One Happy Family. So there are some shows that are expanding. It's hard to, Mo, second season of Mo, it's hard to predict what's happening, what will happen next. But I think in terms of representation, it's just extremely important for Arab and Muslim writers to get their stories out there. Hollywood has a tendency to redo old stories. They redid Aladdin. They're going to redo it again. They like to take old things and make them new for new audiences. There are so many stories out there. Let's explore those stories. And, I often say that the terrorist stereotype is powerful because it's been repeated so often, and that the only way to really challenge that is by having thousands of other stories. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, how does that look like in terms of communities? How can communities organize to be able to participate in that? Because I don't know much about the state of Muslim communities or Arab communities on the US or Latin communities or migrant communities. But how do you see it? What's your own reflections on the state of migrant communities now in the US? And if we can imagine a team of advisors, what would be your advice to these communities?
I think my advice would be that we need donors. We need people who have money, who can support creating new companies to contribute to the media industry. I think about to my knowledge, it's newish, Watermelon Pictures, that is producing Palestine-related work. So I look at something like that as really promising and what we need. More production companies that are funded, that can elevate people's stories. Stories are really powerful. I mean, I think about how every night I watch something on TV, so every night I'm consuming some kind of story. And so we need more of our stories rather than the ones that these big companies are producing and that we are consuming. So I think it's really important to figure out how to get people's stories out there. There are so many talented writers out there, so many people who have stories, even if they're not good writers, they can be paired with a good writer. And we need production companies. So I think Watermelon Pictures probably gives us some kind of template to see where they're going to go in the future and to see other kinds of companies like that.
How about the students?
The students give me hope. Seeing the students in their encampments, they want a better world. You know, we're being taught to go about business as usual, that there's a genocide going on, but you get up and you go to class and you go to school and you're well behaved. And so they are showing that they don't want to be part of institutions for which genocide is normalized. They are demanding something better. And they definitely fill me with hope that they're not complacent and that they are willing to fight for what's right.
But how does that look like in terms of engagement? I mean, as students, as a postgrad myself, it's very difficult to focus on anything. Many things feels irrelevant. Many things that many projects that we thought about now feel irrelevant. And we talk to our professors, and they do tell us that, well, there is an underlying logics that you understand that will help you apply on other things, and it's important to focus on this part. But even institutionally, I feel like we are gonna struggle more and more to get out there, because the kind of opportunities that present themselves are also affected by the systematic marginalization, are also affected by what's happening in the state of the world. And I don't know how this affects scholarship. I mean, one thing is talking about AI and how it is affecting everyone, but another thing is to talk about what humans are doing also.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you in terms of I have a lot of graduate students who are very much impacted by what's happening, who also are living their lives feeling a sense of meaninglessness. And what I try to advise them is you can change your topic to do something that you feel meaningful. I do think, and I do also respect each person's decision in terms of if they decide this isn't what they want to do and they're more aligned doing something else. But for those who do want to continue, I try to remind them that we do need people who are able to talk about these things. So if I have a student I have two students right now who are in American studies but specialize in Iran. We need people who can have those conversations, who can help us understand Iran, who can help us understand the cultural politics and politics of U.S.-Iranian relations historically. These moments will continue coming up. I have students who focus directly on Palestine, and we need them. We need their voice. We need their expertise. We need their analysis. But I understand the sense of feeling like nothing is meaningful right now.
Now, let me end on this note. How does a successful or a healthy or people-based, people-centered inclusion or representation look like? How does your representation utopia look like?
I think similar to my last answer, which is having access to a multitude of stories that aren't reduced or determined by limitations in our cultural logic. It's not limited to, oh, we can do it, but if you're a patriotic Arab, we can do it. I didn't get into the nominal Muslim, but we had representations of Muslims who aren't religious and therefore they're acceptable. So if we can move away from these categories, we can represent you if you fit into this mold and instead really explore. If there are 2 billion Muslims in the world, it's a lot of stories. I'd like to hear other people's stories.
Dr. Evelyn, thank you so much. This has been a very enriching and really, really nice conversation. And I hope we will have you again on the Marginalized Notes podcast. And allow me to thank everyone who have listened to this. And until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.